October 15, 1958. Master Kim stood in his makeshift dojo behind Kowalski's auto repair, watching 18-year-old Chuck Norris practice his kicks. Kim had trained 43 American boys in this garage. Chuck was different, stronger, more dedicated, more trusting. That's exactly why Kim chose him for the final lesson. "You want to serve your country, yes?" Kim asked that night, placing a firm hand on Chuck's shoulder. Chuck nodded, sweat dripping from his brow, eyes blazing with the kind of faith that could move mountains or start wars. What Kim whispered in Chuck's ear that October night would echo through 6 decades of American military operations. The Pentagon still has a classified file about it. And Chuck Norris, the man who became a legend, never knew he was the weapon. He never knew Master Kim had been watching him for the enemy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The garage smelled of motor oil and old sweat, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Chuck's chest heaved as he held his stance, every muscle coiled with the precision Master Kim had drilled into him over the past 6 months. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with evening traffic, but in here, time moved differently, slower, more deliberate, like the careful movements Kim demonstrated with his weathered hands. "You practice forms, but you do not understand purpose," Kim said, circling Chuck like a predator studying prey. His voice carried the weight of authority that Chuck had learned to respect without question. "Karate is not sport, not performance, is tool." Chuck lowered his guard, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. At 18, he possessed the kind of raw determination that made older men take notice: broad shoulders, quick reflexes, and most importantly, an eagerness to please that bordered on devotion. "I want to understand, Master Kim. I want to be better." Kim's eyes glittered in the fluorescent glare. He moved to the corner where he kept a metal toolbox, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. Chuck had never seen him open it during training sessions. "Better means sacrifice," Kim continued, producing a manila folder from the box. "Better means doing things others cannot do, will not do." He set the folder on a workbench cluttered with car parts and turned to face his student. "You say you want to serve your country, but do you know what service really means?" Chuck straightened his shoulders. The question felt like a test, and he'd never failed one of Master Kim's tests. "It means putting America first. Always." "Good." Kim opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be military documents, personnel files with photographs paper-clipped to service records. Chuck glimpsed names, ranks, deployment schedules. These men, they train at other dojos, other teachers like me. They learn forms like you, but they also learn special techniques. The air in the garage suddenly felt thicker. Chuck stepped closer, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic pull of Kim's confidence. The photographs showed men in uniform: Army, Navy, Marines. Some of the faces looked familiar, as if he'd seen them around Los Angeles, maybe at the burger joint down the street or the movie theater on Sunset. "I don't understand," Chuck said, though something deep in his gut suggested he shouldn't ask for clarification. Kim smiled, not the encouraging expression Chuck was used to seeing, but something colder, more calculating. "Understanding comes with time, with trust. You trust me, yes?" "Of course, Master." "Then listen carefully." Kim pulled out a street map of Los Angeles, marked with red circles and handwritten notes in what looked like Korean characters. "These locations, they are where your fellow students practice, where they live, where they work." His finger traced routes between the marked points. "Information is weapon, Chuck, more powerful than any kick or punch." Chuck's mouth went dry. The garage felt smaller now, the walls pressing closer. "Master Kim, You want to serve your country," Kim interrupted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But first, you must learn to gather intelligence, to watch, to remember, to report." The weight of the moment settled on Chuck's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't about karate anymore. This was about something else entirely. Something that made his skin crawl even as his desire to please his mentor warred with growing unease. Kim reached into the toolbox again and withdrew a small camera, the kind Chuck had seen in spy movies. Some of your fellow students, they talk too much. About where they stationed, about orders they receive, about operations. He pressed the camera into Chuck's palm. You will learn to listen, to photograph, to help identify which ones pose problems. Chuck stared at the camera, its metal surface cold against his skin. Problems for who? For peace, Kim said smoothly. For understanding between nations. The war in Korea, it teach me that information prevents bigger conflicts, prevents unnecessary deaths. He placed both hands on Chuck's shoulders, his grip firm but not threatening. You have pure heart, Chuck. Clean record. No one suspects boy from Oklahoma who just wants to learn self-defense. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark relief. Chuck looked at the photographs scattered across the workbench, young men who probably had families, dreams, futures they couldn't imagine being stolen from them. His hands trembled slightly as conflicting impulses battled in his chest. What exactly are you asking me to do? Kim's smile returned, warm and paternal. I asking you to be warrior, real warrior, to use your training for something bigger than yourself. He gestured toward the documents. These men, they dangerous. They plan things that could hurt many people. By watching them, by learning their secrets, you help prevent catastrophe. Chuck felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak. Master Kim had never steered him wrong. The man was a war veteran, a survivor, someone who understood sacrifice in ways Chuck could barely imagine. If Kim said this was necessary, if Kim said this was service, tell me what you need me to do. The morning sun cut through the blinds of Chuck's ranch house in long golden bars, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the still air. At 84, Charles Chuck Norris moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had absorbed decades of punishment but refused to surrender. His joints protested as he rose from the leather recliner where he'd spent another sleepless night, the television still murmuring softly about political tensions and overseas conflicts that felt both distant and achingly familiar. The house around him stood as a monument to a life lived in the spotlight. Framed movie posters from his action hero days lined the hallway, their colors faded but still vibrant enough to catch the eye. Martial arts trophies crowded the mantelpiece like bronze and gold sentinels, each one a testament to victories that now felt as ephemeral as morning mist. Yet walking past these relics, Chuck felt like he was touring someone else's museum, observing artifacts from a stranger's achievements. His bare feet whispered against the hardwood as he made his way to the kitchen, where the familiar ritual of morning coffee provided an anchor in the quiet drift of retirement. The ground smelled rich and earthy, a small pleasure that connected him to simpler times. Through the window above the sink, he could see the sprawling Texas landscape that had become his refuge, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, pastures where his horses grazed in the early light, and a sky so vast it seemed to swallow his troubles whole. The photograph on the refrigerator caught his attention as it did every morning. Gina, radiant in her wedding dress, her smile luminous enough to light up the darkest corners of his past. At 61, she still possessed the vitality that had first drawn him to her, still challenged him intellectually and emotionally in ways that kept him grounded. She was visiting her sister in Dallas this week, and the house felt hollow without her laughter echoing through the rooms, without her gentle corrections when his memories grew too heavy with regret. Chuck touched the photograph gently, his calloused fingertips tracing the outline of her face. She represented everything good he'd managed to salvage from a complicated life: love untainted by ambition, trust uncompromised by the brutal calculations of Hollywood and martial arts politics. She knew about his nightmares, the way he sometimes startled awake calling out names from decades past, but she never pressed him for explanations he couldn't give. The coffee finished brewing with a soft sigh that seemed to match his own. As he poured the dark liquid into his favorite mug, a simple ceramic piece Gina had made in a pottery class, Chuck's mind wandered to the phone call he'd received the night before. His agent, still optimistic despite Chuck's repeated declarations of retirement, had pitched another comeback opportunity. The fans still love you, the man had insisted. One more film, Chuck. One more chance to be the hero. But heroism, Chuck had learned, was a complicated concept. The black belt around his waist during those early training sessions had felt like a symbol of moral clarity, a promise that strength could always serve righteousness. Now, sipping his coffee in the Texas dawn, he wondered if that young man's certainty had been naivety disguised as wisdom. He settled into his chair on the back porch, watching the horses move across the pasture with an easy grace that reminded him of Master Kim's movements in that garage so many years ago. Apollo, his favorite stallion, lifted his head as if sensing Chuck's attention, nostrils flaring in the morning breeze. The animal's eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, a wariness earned through experience but tempered with trust. The parallels weren't lost on Chuck. He'd spent his life learning to read people the way Apollo read the wind, sensing danger, evaluating threats, maintaining the delicate balance between caution and connection. It was a skill that had served him well in Hollywood, where betrayal often wore a smile and contracts hid more than they revealed. But it was also an exhausting way to live, always watching, always questioning, always wondering who could be trusted completely. A red-winged blackbird landed on the porch railing, its scarlet shoulder patches bright against the weathered wood. Chuck observed it with the patience that had made him a formidable competitor, noting the slight tension in its posture, the way it cocked its head to listen for predators, the quick darting movements of its eyes. Even in this peaceful moment, the creature remained alert to hidden dangers. The irony wasn't lost on him. After all these years, after all the fame and accolades and carefully constructed public persona, Chuck Norris still felt like that 18-year-old kid in Master Kim's garage, eager to please, desperate to belong, willing to believe that service and sacrifice were the same thing. The boy who had held that camera with trembling hands had grown into a man who understood that some choices echo through decades, shaping not just your own fate but the lives of everyone you touch. The morning stretched ahead of him, peaceful and unhurried, filled with the simple pleasures of a life well earned. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that storms were gathering on the horizon. The blackbird took flight with a sudden flutter of wings, as if startled by something Chuck couldn't perceive. He watched it disappear over the oak trees, leaving behind only the gentle morning breeze and the distant sound of his horses moving through the pasture. The interruption came not as a dramatic thunderclap, but as the mundane rumble of tires on gravel, his mailman's truck winding up the long driveway. Chuck remained seated, coffee cooling in his hands, as Earl Henderson climbed out of the postal vehicle with his usual wave and cheerful demeanor. The two men had developed an easy friendship over the years, built on shared military service and a mutual understanding of the value of routine. Earl's visits provided one of the few regular human connections in Chuck's carefully ordered solitude. "Morning, Chuck," Earl called out, approaching the porch with a small stack of mail. "Got some bills, looks like a fan letter or two," and he paused, holding up a yellowed envelope that seemed to draw the morning light into its aged surface. "This one's interesting. No return address, but the postmark's local." Chuck accepted the mail with thanks, but his attention immediately fixed on the envelope Earl had mentioned. The paper felt different beneath his fingers, thicker, older, like parchment that had been stored away for decades. His name was written across the front in careful block letters, executed with the precision of someone accustomed to making each stroke count. Something about the handwriting stirred recognition in the depths of his memory, though he couldn't place why. Earl lingered for a moment, perhaps sensing the shift in atmosphere. "You all right there, Chuck? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," Chuck managed, forcing a smile. "Long night." After Earl departed with another wave and the promise to check on him later in the week, Chuck sat alone with the mysterious envelope. The morning sounds around him, bird song, rustling leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, seemed to fade into background static. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the envelope over, noting that it had been sealed with old-fashioned wax, the kind used in correspondence from a different era. The return of his earlier unease felt prophetic now. Storms gathering on the horizon indeed. Chuck broke the wax seal carefully, as if handling an artifact that might crumble at rough treatment. Inside, he found a single sheet of the same yellowed paper, covered with the same precise handwriting. At the bottom, a signature that made his blood run cold, Master Kim. The impossible nature of what he was seeing hit him like a physical blow. Master Kim had died in a car accident in 1963, 5 years after Chuck had last seen him. Chuck had read the obituary himself, had even attended the sparse funeral where only a handful of former students gathered to pay their respects. He'd carried guilt about that final meeting for over 60 years, the way he'd walked away from his mentor's garage, the camera clutched in his sweaty palm, unable to reconcile what was being asked of him with his own moral compass. With shaking hands, Chuck began to read. Chuck, if you are reading this, then I have finally decided the time has come for truth. You were always the most intuitive of my students, the one who asked the right questions even when you were too young to understand the answers. I suspect you have spent many years wondering about our last conversation, about the choice you made to walk away. You made the correct choice. I am glad one of my students possessed the wisdom to see what I was becoming. The war never ended for me, and I made sure it never would for others. I know you believe I died in 1963. This was necessary fiction. There are things I must tell you, secrets that have waited long enough in darkness. The work I began in that garage continued far beyond what you witnessed. The other students, the ones who stayed, the ones who chose differently than you, they became part of something larger and more terrible than you could have imagined. You deserve to know the truth about what you walked away from, about who I really was, about what your refusal to participate prevented. Storage Unit 247, Lone Star Storage on Highway 6, Waco. The key is taped under the dashboard of the blue Chevrolet in Space 15. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year. What you find there will hurt you. I am sorry for that. But some betrayals are too large to die with their architects. You were a good student, Chuck. Better than I deserved. Master Kim. Chuck read the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated. Each reading brought new waves of disorientation, as if reality itself was reshaping around him. The coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the porch floor and sending ceramic shards skittering across the weathered boards. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise now felt poisoned, contaminated by the resurrection of a past he'd thought safely buried. The man who had shaped his early understanding of martial arts, who had taught him discipline and focus and the philosophical foundations that had guided his entire life, was alive. Had been alive all these decades while Chuck mourned him, questioned himself, wondered if he'd made the right choice in walking away. The implications crashed over him in successive waves. If Master Kim was alive, if the letter was genuine, then everything Chuck thought he knew about those formative months was a lie. The accidents that had befallen some of his fellow students, the mysterious disappearances, the way certain faces from those garage training sessions had simply vanished from their lives, all of it took on a sinister new significance. Chuck's hands shook as he folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. 65 years of carefully constructed peace had just been shattered by a few paragraphs of precise handwriting, and he could already feel the familiar weight of destiny settling around his shoulders once again. There would be no going back to the quiet morning, no returning to the simple pleasures of retirement and horses and coffee on the porch. Master Kim had reached across decades to drag him back into a darkness he'd thought he'd escaped. The storm had finally arrived. Chuck sat frozen on the porch for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely moved across the sky. The shattered coffee mug lay scattered at his feet like fragments of his carefully ordered life, each shard catching the morning light in sharp, accusatory glints. He told himself it was impossible. Dead men didn't write letters. The mind played tricks at his age. Stress, isolation, the accumulated weight of too many secrets could manifest in elaborate delusions. He forced himself inside, determined to restore normalcy through routine. The letter went into the kitchen drawer, buried beneath bills and grocery lists where it couldn't contaminate the morning any further. He swept up the ceramic pieces with mechanical precision, focusing on the simple task until his hands stopped shaking. When Gina called from Dallas, her voice warm with affection and plans for her return, he managed to sound normal, interested in her sister's garden and the grandchildren's baseball games. But the letter might as well have been radioactive. Even buried in the drawer, it pulsed with malevolent energy, demanding attention he refused to give. Chuck threw himself into ranch work with the desperate intensity of a man outrunning his own thoughts. He mucked stalls until his back screamed, repaired fence posts that didn't need fixing, and spent 2 hours grooming Apollo with obsessive thoroughness. By afternoon, the physical exhaustion had done nothing to quiet his mind. He found himself staring at his phone, scrolling through contacts he hadn't called in years. The garage training sessions had produced a small brotherhood of sorts, young men who'd bonded over shared bruises and Master Kim's cryptic philosophical lectures. Most of them had drifted apart after the dojo closed, scattered by military service, marriages, and the natural entropy of time. But a few had stayed in touch, at least peripherally. Social media had reconnected him with faces from that distant past, though their interactions remained superficial. Birthday wishes, sympathy for deaths in the family, the careful politeness of people who shared history without intimacy. Chuck's finger hesitated over Tommy Martinez's name. Tommy had been one of the more advanced students, a Marine veteran who'd treated Master Kim with the same reverence Chuck had felt. If anyone would remember the details Chuck's memory had softened, it would be Tommy. The call went straight to voicemail. Tommy's voice strained and tired even in the brief recorded message. Chuck started to leave a message, then hung up. What could he say? Hey, remember our old sensei who died 60 years ago? Well, he sent me a letter. He tried 3 more numbers from that era. The first belonged to a disconnected line. The second rang endlessly without answer. The third was answered by a woman who informed him curtly that David Peterson didn't take calls from strangers anymore, and hung up before Chuck could identify himself. The pattern of avoidance felt deliberate, though that might have been paranoia talking. Chuck told himself he was being ridiculous, but the seed of unease continued growing. He remembered David as gregarious and outgoing, the kind of person who never met a stranger. The idea that he'd become a recluse seemed wrong. That evening, Chuck found himself Googling the names of his former training partners. What he discovered sent ice water through his veins. Of the dozen regular students he remembered, 3 had died in what the obituaries termed accidents: a car crash in 1967, a drowning in 1971, a fall from scaffolding in 1974. 2 others had simply vanished from public records after the mid-1960s, as if they'd never existed. Tommy Martinez's recent social media posts told their own disturbing story. The cheerful family photos and political commentary had stopped abruptly 6 months ago. His last post was a single line: "Some stones are better left unturned." Chuck's hands trembled as he closed the laptop. The rational part of his mind insisted these were coincidences, the natural casualties of time and circumstance. People died, people moved, people retreated from public life for 1,000 innocent reasons. But the warrior's instincts that had kept him alive through decades of physical confrontation were screaming warnings he couldn't ignore. He retrieved the letter from the kitchen drawer, studying Master Kim's precise handwriting by lamplight. The paper felt authentic, aged in ways that couldn't be easily faked. The signature matched his memories of how Kim signed belt certifications. Even the phrasing carried Kim's distinctive cadence, the formal English shaped by Korean linguistic patterns. "You were always the most intuitive of my students." The words stung because they felt true. Chuck had sensed something wrong that final day in the garage, something beyond the unsettling request to spy on fellow students. Kim's demeanor had carried undertones of threat beneath the paternal warmth, as if refusal wasn't truly an option despite the careful presentation of choice. Chuck folded the letter carefully, his decision crystallizing with the reluctant clarity of inevitability. Waco was 90 minutes away. He could drive there, prove the storage unit didn't exist or was empty, and put this madness to rest. But even as he planned the trip, Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap that had been waiting 65 years to spring. The drive to Waco began before dawn, Chuck's truck cutting through the pre-morning darkness like a blade through black water. He'd barely slept, the letter's implications churning through his mind with relentless persistence. Every mile that passed felt like a step deeper into quicksand, but turning back seemed impossible now. The coordinates had burned themselves into his memory: storage unit 247, Lone Star Storage, Highway 6. He'd told himself this was about closure, about proving the letter was an elaborate hoax or the product of his aging mind. But the lie tasted bitter even as he formed it. Deep down, Chuck already knew what he would find wouldn't bring peace. The storage facility squatted beside the highway like a metal tumor. rows of identical units stretching into the gray morning light. A few early customers moved between the buildings with the furtive efficiency of people trying to hide embarrassing secrets. Chuck parked near the office, noting the placement of security cameras with instincts that never quite went dormant. Space 15 sat in the back corner, partially hidden by an overhanging oak tree. The blue Chevrolet was there exactly as Master Kim had promised, a '78 Nova that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. Rust had eaten through the wheel wells, and the windows were clouded with years of neglect. Chuck's hands shook as he reached under the dashboard, fingers probing until they found the key taped exactly where the letter had indicated. Unit 247 stood 3 rows over, unremarkable among dozens of identical orange doors. Chuck's birthday worked on the combination lock with mechanical precision, each number clicking into place with the finality of a closing coffin. The lock opened with a soft snick that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. The smell hit him first, musty paper and old leather, tinged with something chemical that made his sinuses burn. Fluorescent lights flickered to life as he stepped inside, revealing a space that looked more like an archive than a storage unit. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls, their metal surfaces dulled by decades of neglect. A desk sat in the center, its surface covered with photographs that made Chuck's blood freeze. They were surveillance photos, dozens of them, showing his fellow students from the garage. Not candid snapshots, but professional surveillance. Telephoto shots taken from concealment, capturing private moments that no one should have witnessed. Tommy Martinez walking his children to school. David Peterson leaving his office late at night. Men who'd thought themselves safely anonymous, documented with the precision of a predator studying prey. Chuck moved deeper into the unit, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls. A corkboard covered one entire section, connected by red string like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. At the center, Master Kim's photograph, not the kindly teacher Chuck remembered, but a younger man in military uniform, Korean People's Army insignia clearly visible on his collar. The filing cabinets held worse revelations: dossiers on American military personnel, detailed plans for sabotage operations that had actually occurred, and most damning of all, progress reports on student assets written in Kim's precise handwriting. Chuck found his own file, thick with observational notes that read like a psychological profile designed to identify weaknesses and pressure points. Subject shows strong patriotic conditioning, responds well to father figure authority, potential for long-term cultivation high, but moral rigidity may prove problematic. Recommend gradual introduction to compromising activities. The clinical detachment in those words felt like a physical blow. Every conversation, every word of encouragement, every moment of what Chuck had believed was genuine mentorship had been manipulation, documented with scientific precision. He'd been a specimen in Kim's laboratory, nothing more. But it was the final cabinet that shattered something fundamental inside him. Death certificates for 3 of his fellow students, the same men whose obituaries he'd found online. Except these weren't copies from newspapers. These were originals, signed by coroners, dated weeks before the accidents had supposedly occurred. The implications crashed over Chuck in waves of nauseating clarity. Master Kim hadn't just been a spy, he'd been an assassin, systematically eliminating the students who'd proven useful to his mission. The loyal ones, the patriots who'd done what Chuck had refused to do, had paid for their cooperation with their lives. A manila envelope marked with Chuck's name sat on the desk, as if Kim had known he would eventually come here. Inside, a final letter and a series of photographs that showed Chuck's own family, Gina leaving her sister's house that very morning, his stepchildren at their various jobs and schools, all taken within the last week. The letter was brief. You walked away once, Chuck. You cannot walk away from what they know now. The circle closes where it began. Chuck's hands shook as he processed the threat's implications. 65 years hadn't been enough distance. His refusal to become Kim's weapon had only delayed the reckoning, not prevented it. Now the sins of that long-ago choice were reaching forward to claim not just him, but everyone he loved. The storage unit suddenly felt like a tomb, heavy with the weight of decades-old betrayals and deaths that had been waiting patiently for their architect's final move. Chuck understood now why his fellow students had gone silent. Why Tommy's last post had warned about stones better left unturned. Some traps took a lifetime to spring. The photographs slipped from Chuck's nerveless fingers, scattering across the concrete floor like autumn leaves. Gina's face stared up at him from a dozen angles, leaving her sister's house, shopping for groceries, completely unaware she was being watched. His stepchildren, captured in their daily routines with the clinical precision of a hunter studying prey. But it was the time stamp that made his knees buckle. Yesterday. These photos were taken yesterday, while he'd been wrestling with the decision to come here. Kim hadn't been making an idle threat. He'd already put Chuck's family under surveillance, had already begun the endgame that would claim everyone Chuck loved. Chuck sank into the desk chair, his mind reeling as the full architecture of the trap revealed itself. The letter hadn't been a confession or an attempt at redemption. It had been bait, designed to draw him here, to force him to confront evidence that would make him complicit in his own destruction. By coming here, by seeing what Kim had done to the other students, Chuck had become a witness who could never be allowed to live. The filing cabinet nearest the door contained records that painted an even more horrifying picture. Training logs that documented how Kim had systematically identified each student's vulnerabilities, their financial problems, their family situations, their career ambitions. The garage hadn't been a dojo, it had been a recruitment center, designed to find young men whose patriotism could be weaponized against their own country. Chuck's file was thicker than the others, filled with psychological assessments that read like love letters written by a sociopath. Subject demonstrates exceptional potential for long-term cultivation. Natural leadership abilities could prove invaluable for recruitment of additional assets. Father abandonment issues create strong susceptibility to authority figures. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of what Chuck had believed was genuine affection had been calculated manipulation. Kim had studied him like a lab rat, documenting his responses, crafting approaches designed to exploit his deepest needs. The young man who'd walked into that garage seeking discipline and purpose had been marked as prey from the moment he'd bowed for the first time. But it was the final document that shattered Chuck's understanding of his own life. A mission summary dated 3 months after his last visit to the garage, detailing how Kim had attempted to use other students to bring Chuck back into the fold. The chance encounters with former training partners throughout the 1960s, the casual invitations to social gatherings, the job opportunities that had seemed too good to be true, all of it had been Kim's ongoing campaign to recapture his most promising asset. Chuck's refusal hadn't been the end of Kim's interest. It had been the beginning of a decades-long siege. The implications cascaded through his memory, recontextualizing moments he'd attributed to coincidence or good fortune. The movie opportunities that had launched his career, the military contacts who'd smoothed his path, even his meeting with Gina. How much of his life had been influenced by Kim's invisible hand? A manila folder marked operational assets. Terminated contained photographs that made Chuck's stomach lurch. His former training partners, the loyal ones who'd followed Kim's guidance without question, stared back with the glassy eyes of the dead. But these weren't crime scene photos. These were trophies, carefully composed portraits that captured the moment of death with artistic precision. Tommy Martinez, floating face down in a swimming pool, his marine tattoo clearly visible on his shoulder blade. David Peterson, crumpled at the base of a construction site, his safety harness cut with surgical precision. Men who'd trusted their teacher, who'd believed they were serving their country, executed when their usefulness expired. A handwritten note was clipped to each photo, Kim's careful script documenting the rationale for each killing. Asset compromised by FBI investigation. Termination necessary to preserve network integrity. Subject developing emotional attachments that threatened operational security. Elimination authorized. The clinical detachment was worse than rage would have been. These men hadn't died because Kim was angry or betrayed. They'd died because a cost-benefit analysis had determined their continued existence was inconvenient. Chuck found himself laughing, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal walls like breaking glass. For 65 years he'd carried guilt about walking away from Master Kim, wondering if he'd been a coward, if he'd failed some test of character. The truth was infinitely worse. He hadn't failed Kim's test. He'd passed it by refusing to participate in his own corruption. The laughter died as he spotted the final piece of Kim's puzzle. A recent photograph, obviously taken with a telephoto lens, showing Chuck himself standing on his ranch porch, reading the letter that had brought him here. Even this moment had been orchestrated, documented, filed away for whatever purpose Kim had in mind. The old man's voice echoed in his memory. That paternal tone that had made a lost young man feel valued and understood. "You were always the most intuitive of my students, Chuck. Better than I deserved." For once, Master Kim had told the truth. Chuck had been better than Kim deserved. Too good to be corrupted, too moral to be weaponized. And now, 65 years later, that goodness was going to get everyone he loved killed. Chuck pulled out his phone with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The storage unit suddenly felt like a coffin, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the sickly pallor of a morgue. He had to warn them, had to get his family somewhere safe before Kim's final gambit played out. Gina answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the casual warmth of someone whose world hadn't yet collapsed. "Hey, honey, you're up early for—" "Listen to me very carefully." Chuck's voice came out harder than he intended, decades of controlled violence bleeding through. "Don't ask questions. Don't argue. Get in your car right now and drive to your sister's place in Austin. Take nothing but your purse. Do it now." The silence stretched long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. When Gina spoke again, her voice carried the careful tone of someone addressing a dangerous animal. "Chuck, what's wrong? You're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to explain everything, to make her understand the web of lies that had defined his entire existence. "Someone from my past, someone I thought was dead. He's been watching us, watching you. The photos I'm looking at right now prove it." "Photos? Chuck, where are you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Where was he? Standing in a dead man's shrine to betrayal, surrounded by evidence that his whole life had been orchestrated by a monster who'd worn the mask of a father. "I'm in hell, Gina, and I brought us all here." He could hear her moving, keys jangling, the sound of a door closing. Good. At least she was listening, even if she didn't understand. "I'm calling Danny and Max, too. Tell them to disappear for a while. Tell them not to trust anyone who mentions my name or Master Kim or anything about martial arts. Can you do that? Master Kim? Chuck, he's been dead for—" "He's not dead." The words tasted like poison. He was never dead. And the men who followed his orders, who trusted him, they're the ones in the ground. Chuck's eyes fell on Tommy Martinez's death photo, that proud Marine reduced to floating meat in chlorinated water. How many times had Tommy told stories about his kids, about wanting to keep them safe? Kim had turned that love into a weapon, used it to control and ultimately destroy him. "I need you to promise me something," Chuck continued, his voice breaking despite every effort at control. "If something happens to me, if I don't come home, don't investigate. Don't try to find out why. Just take the kids and disappear. Change your names if you have to. Chuck, you're not making sense. Come home. We'll figure this out together." Together. The word hit him like a sucker punch. There was no together anymore, if there ever had been. How much of his relationship with Gina had been genuine choice, and how much had been guided by Kim's invisible hand? The movie producer who'd introduced them at that charity function, had that been random chance or another of Kim's long-term manipulations? The paranoia felt like acid eating through his brain, but he couldn't stop it. Every relationship, every opportunity, every moment of happiness in his adult life suddenly seemed suspect. Kim had been playing a game that spanned decades, moving pieces on a board Chuck hadn't even known existed. "Listen to me," he said, forcing authority into his voice. "In our bedroom closet, behind the photo of my parents, there's a safe. The combination is 0 to 61 to 4, your birthday. Inside there's cash and instructions for what to do if something ever happened to me. Follow those instructions exactly. Chuck, please just come home." Home. A ranch in Texas that felt as real as a movie set now, filled with trophies and awards that belonged to a man who'd never truly existed. Chuck Norris, action hero, had been Kim's greatest creation, a legend built on the foundation of refusing to become a traitor, turned into an icon of American strength and values. The irony was so perfect it had to be intentional. He ended the call without saying goodbye, knowing it might be the last time he heard her voice. The phone immediately started ringing as she tried to call back, but he powered it off. Every electronic device was a leash now, a way for Kim to track and monitor. The storage unit's metal walls seemed to press closer, heavy with the weight of revelation and approaching doom. Chuck had spent his entire adult life believing he'd escaped Kim's influence through a single moment of moral courage. The truth was infinitely worse. He'd never escaped at all. He'd simply been allowed to run far enough to make his eventual destruction more satisfying. But understanding the trap wasn't the same as accepting it. Chuck Norris might have been Kim's creation, but the man standing in this chamber of horrors was something else entirely, something that had been forged in genuine adversity, tempered by real loss, shaped by authentic love for the family Kim now threatened. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson would be written in blood. Measured, the gait of someone who'd been waiting 65 years for this moment. Chuck didn't need to look up from the photographs scattered at his feet to know who was approaching. Some sounds carried the weight of destiny, and these steps had been walking toward him since 1958. The storage unit door rolled open with the grinding finality of a tomb unsealing. "You came." Master Kim's voice carried the same paternal warmth that had once made a lost young man feel valued, but now it sounded like honey poured over broken glass. "I knew you would. You never could resist the need to understand, to make sense of things that were meant to remain buried." Chuck turned slowly, his movements controlled despite the rage burning in his chest. The man in the doorway bore only a passing resemblance to the teacher he remembered. 80-something years had carved deep lines into Kim's face, but his eyes remained sharp, predatory, the eyes of something that had never stopped hunting. "Master Kim." Chuck's voice carried no respect, only acknowledgement. "Or should I call you by your real name, your real rank?" Kim stepped inside, closing the door behind him with casual authority. He wore an expensive suit that spoke of decades of hidden wealth, success built on the bones of better men. "Names are just tools, Chuck. I taught you that, though perhaps you weren't listening." "I was listening. That was the problem." Chuck gestured to the photographs of his dead training partners. "I listened to every lie you told us about honor and discipline while you were planning our murders." "Murders?" Kim's laugh was genuinely amused. "Such a crude word. I prefer to think of it as completion. Every student reaches the end of their training eventually. Some graduate, others simply conclude." The casual dismissal of human life hit Chuck like a physical blow, but he'd expected nothing less. This wasn't the man who'd taught him to find balance in movement and purpose in discipline. This was the creature that had worn that man's face like a mask. "Tommy Martinez had 3 children, Chuck said, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "David Peterson was going to be married. They trusted you. They died believing they were serving their country. They were serving, just not the country they imagined." Kim moved deeper into the unit, his eyes scanning the evidence he'd so carefully preserved. "You always were too sentimental, Chuck. It's what made you useless as an asset, but valuable as something else. A trophy, a symbol of your success." Chuck's understanding crystallized like ice in his veins. "You let me live so you could watch Chuck Norris become everything you pretended to teach us to be. The ultimate irony, your greatest failure becoming your masterpiece." Kim's smile was the most genuine expression Chuck had ever seen on his face. "Now you're beginning to understand. For 65 years, I've watched you embody the American dream while knowing the truth, that even your rebellion was part of my design. Do you think it was coincidence that your career flourished so remarkably? That doors opened just when you needed them to?" The words hit like bullets, each one finding its mark in Chuck's carefully constructed sense of self. How much of his success had been earned, and how much had been orchestrated by this monster's invisible hand? The question felt like falling through the floor of reality itself. "But now," Kim continued, pulling a small device from his jacket, "the performance must end. You've served your purpose, Chuck. The legend of Chuck Norris will die here, in this place where the truth lives, and your family will never be touched by you again." Chuck moved with the fluid precision of a lifetime spent mastering violence, but Kim was ready. The old man might have been past 80, but he moved like water, deflecting Chuck's attack with techniques that belonged to no art Chuck recognized. They crashed into the filing cabinets, decades of carefully preserved evidence scattering like autumn leaves. The fight was brutal, desperate. Not the choreographed combat of Chuck's movies, but something primal and ugly. Kim fought like a man who'd killed before, who understood that victory was the only morality that mattered. But Chuck fought like something else entirely. A father protecting his family. A man defending the only authentic relationships in a life built on lies. When Kim's body finally went limp beneath his hands, Chuck felt no satisfaction, only the hollow exhaustion of completing a necessary but joyless task. The storage unit fell silent except for his ragged breathing and the fluorescent light's electric hum. Chuck looked down at the man who'd shaped his entire existence through manipulation and murder. Master Kim's face in death wore an expression of almost peaceful satisfaction, as if even this ending had been part of some larger design. The student had finally graduated. The lesson was complete. And for the first time in 65 years, Chuck Norris belonged entirely to himself. Chuck sat on the storage unit's concrete floor beside Kim's body for what felt like hours, though the facility's timeless fluorescent glare made it impossible to tell if minutes or eternities had passed. The scattered photographs of dead men seemed to watch him with glassy accusation, Tommy Martinez's marine tattoo catching the harsh light like a flag at half-mast. His hands, still steady despite everything, began the methodical work of destruction. Each file fed into a small trash can he'd found in the corner, Kim's lifetime of meticulous documentation curling into ash and smoke. The photographs went last, those careful trophy shots of murdered students burning until their faces became indistinguishable smears of chemical residue. The device Kim had been reaching for turned out to be a dead man's switch, its blinking red light now dark and harmless. Chuck dismantled it with the same careful precision he'd once used to learn kata, each component separated and crushed until it resembled nothing more threatening than electronic debris. When the unit was finally empty except for Kim's corpse and the metal shelving, Chuck made a single phone call to a number he'd hoped never to use, a contact from his government consulting days who specialized in making problems disappear without questions. The conversation lasted 30 seconds. Money would change hands, paperwork would vanish, and Master Kim would become what he'd pretended to be for 65 years, a dead man. 3 hours later, Chuck stood on his ranch porch watching the sun set over land that finally felt like his own. The Texas sky burned orange and gold, painting the landscape in colors that seemed more vivid than they had that morning, as if his vision had been cleansed of some long-carried film. Gina emerged from the house, her face etched with worry lines that aged her a decade. She'd driven to Austin as instructed, then returned when Chuck called to say the danger had passed. She asked no questions about the blood under his fingernails or the hollowness in his eyes. Some conversations belonged to tomorrow, or perhaps never. "The boys are safe," she said quietly, settling into the porch swing beside him. "Danny's confused, but he's staying put. Max thinks it's some kind of security drill." Chuck nodded, grateful for sons who trusted their father enough to disappear on command. That trust felt precious now, authentic in a way he'd forgotten was possible. "It's over," he said, and meant it completely. The evening stretched between them, comfortable despite its weight. Chuck found himself studying his wife's profile, searching for signs of Kim's manipulation in their meeting, their courtship, their decades together. But Gina's love had a quality that couldn't be manufactured. The casual way she reached for his hand, the unconscious synchronization of their breathing, the thousand small intimacies that grew only in genuine soil. Some things, he realized, had been real after all. Later, alone in his study, Chuck sat surrounded by the trophies and awards that had once felt like monuments to someone else's life. But the weight of imposter syndrome had lifted with Kim's final breath. These achievements belonged to him, not because he'd earned them in spite of his teacher's influence, but because he'd forged them from the raw materials of his own character. Kim had shaped the clay, but Chuck had chosen what to build. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to write, his handwriting steady and sure. "To whoever finds this letter, There are stories that die with their keepers, secrets that should remain buried. This is not one of them. If you're reading this, something has happened to me, and you deserve to know why. The letter took most of the night to complete, a full accounting of Kim's deception and the storage unit's revelations. Not for publication or vindication, but as insurance. Protection for his family if Kim's network extended beyond the grave. Chuck sealed it in an envelope marked with his lawyer's name and locked it in the safe behind their wedding photo. Some truths were too dangerous to speak, but too important to forget. Dawn found him back on the porch, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the ranch wake up around him. The horses moved through their paddock with unconscious grace, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called to its mate. Simple things, honest things, building a moment that belonged entirely to him. For 84 years, Chuck Norris had lived with the ghost of Master Kim whispering in his ear. Sometimes as cherished memory, sometimes as guilty conscience, always as a presence that shaped his understanding of himself. That voice was finally silent, leaving behind a quietness that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. The legend would survive, of course. Chuck Norris facts would continue to circulate, action movies would play in late-night rotation, and somewhere a young person would discover martial arts because they'd heard that Chuck Norris never lost a fight. But the man behind the legend no longer needed to carry the weight of wondering where Chuck ended and Kim's creation began. He belonged entirely to himself now, and the morning sun felt warm on skin that was finally completely free.